Hi there, this is Bill Bond, and today I'm going to talk about using Hazus to support mitigation planning. Specifically, I'm going to talk about mitigation planning in Virginia. However, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be relevant to the rest of the country. What I want to do today is basically go through a little bit about the software itself, Hazus, but spend most of my time talking about some of the tricks and tips I've learned over the years of using the software to help make sure that you're using it correctly and to kind of the most of its capability. What I'm going to do, I've created a couple of study regions already. And first, if you're not familiar with Hazus, it is FEMA's free risk assessment software. If that was something that you wanted to get, you can go to the MAP Service Center, which is msc.fema.gov, and you'll see on the left here under MSC Products and Tools, there's a link for Hazus. If you click on that, you can come down and download the software. So what I've done today is I've actually assumed that you've gone ahead and you've installed it correctly, and you're already somewhat of a Hazus user. Maybe you just need a little refresher. Right now I'm just assuming that you've already installed it correctly. So you'll see I've already got the software open, installed correctly, opened up on my desktop. You'll notice when you first install, you only have the ability to create a new region and to import a region. So obviously I've already generated a few regions that I'm going to talk about today. Also, I'm going to talk about the three major hazards in this particular state. There are 4 hazards that Hazus covers. So it's flood, both riverine and coastal. Then there's hurricane, wind, and hurricane surge, and then earthquake as well, and those are the 3 I'm going to talk about. But there's also tsunami, which you can't run in Virginia currently. And if you are interested in tsunami, I'll probably do another training session on tsunami. For right now, I'm going to talk about those 3 and some of the concerns when I've been reading the mitigation plans. I've noticed a couple of things that have come up, and I think there's probably better ways to do things, and the software has kind of evolved over time as well, so there's more capabilities. So for right now, what I'm going to do is just open a study region and give you some ideas on some of the limitations and some of the things that you'll want to do as a Hazus user. Again, I'm going to focus on mitigation planning, although this is risk assessment. This is kind of the risk assessment component of mitigation planning, but it could be used for other applications as well. So what we're going to do is just open a study region right now. You see I've selected open a region. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click on next here. You'll see I've created a couple of regions already, a hurricane region, an earthquake region, and a hurricane and flood region. So when you create a study region, let me actually go back to that. When you create a study region, it's going to ask you for the jurisdiction that you want to study. So a lot of times people will pick counties, or maybe a couple of counties, or maybe a smaller jurisdiction in that county or city. So I'm just going to type in test here for my study region name, and I'm going to click on next. At this point I get to select the hazards that I want to study. So a lot of times I'll just select one hazard, and if I want to look at another hazard, I'll create a different study region with that same jurisdiction and just add that other hazard. There are kind of benefits and disadvantages to doing either. Obviously the benefits are if you update your inventory, you only have to do it once. However, if you update the inventory using the state data, you'll see that it's actually in all the future study regions. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and select flood here, and I'll click on next. And I'm going to select, what I'm going to do is maybe select something smaller than a county, just to kind of show you what that looks like. So I'll pick census tract here. You'll see for flood I can also select community or watershed. So community might be a good one to select as well. Then I'm going to click on next here. And I'm going to scroll down to Virginia. I do need to make sure I have the Virginia state data on my computer. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And I'm going to select next here. And what I'm going to do is look at Campbell County and select next. So at this point I don't really know what tracts I want to study, so I'm going to hit show map here. So it's a nice feature. If you are going to make a study a jurisdiction that's smaller than a county, it's good to select the map button there to kind of select it using the map. And as you'll see in just a minute here, you'll be able to actually add data to this as well. So I'll be able to add my jurisdictional map. So in my case, I'm going to look at Brookneal, which is a jurisdiction within Campbell County. Sometimes it takes a few minutes to open up. Okay, once that map comes up, I'll see all the different census tracts within that county, and I'll be able to basically select the jurisdiction I want, either clicking on the tracts themselves or by bringing in a my own polygon to select from. There we go. It did take a while to come up, and it's still coming up. So in Virginia, the mitigation planning is conducted by the planning district commissions, which consist of usually multiple cities and counties within an area, within a region. So usually PDCs are looking at several counties in a city for the mitigation planning, and a lot of times what you may have to do is actually create a separate study region for each county or jurisdiction within that PDC. Other states, I know they've got sometimes it's just county only, but there may be several jurisdictions within that county or city only. So what I can do here, once I have, these are all different census tracts within that county, so what I can do is actually hit this add data, and I can browse to where I've got my my shapefile, which is under Hazus training. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to shapefile. And select on the Campbell County town, then click OK. So I'll end up having two different jurisdictions kind of pop up here, so you can kind of see those there and here. So now I know I'm going to basically focus on this one here, which is a smaller than a census tract. So I'm just going to select this one tract and hit selection done. And you'll see it's going to bring me back to that table that displays all the census tracts. And it's going to have a highlighted census tract for me. So at that point I'll be able to select next and move on to creating this study region. You see it takes a little bit of time. You can also hit down here select by added data. So if I had selected that button, then both of those census tracts that have my data in it would have been selected. Okay, so I can see the tract that's been selected there. Then I click on next, and then I click on finish, and it'll create that study region with only that one single census tract in it. Okay, so that's just to kind of give you an idea of how to create a study region. I'm going to click on cancel here since I've already created mine, and I'm going to click on OK. I'm going to click on next here, and the first thing I'm going to look at is the flood model. So I'm going to click on next, and I'm going to click flood here. So when I created this study region, I selected both flood and hurricane as the hazards. Click on next and then finish. Okay, and this is basically going to open up ArcGIS, and I'm going to have some additional menu functionality. Okay, so I've opened up my study region. This happens to be Virginia Beach, which I can see here. So that's the jurisdiction. And you'll see I've got some additional menu functionality up here. If you're familiar with the ArcGIS interface, I've got inventory, hazard analysis, and results up here now. So I can basically go through and I can take a look at the inventory that Hazus provides. So there's kind of two major categories of inventory. There is the inventory that is at the census block or tract level, so aggregate information. So one type is the general building stock here. So with the general building stock, I can look at square footage, building counts, dollar exposure, and this is represented at the census block level for flood. Okay, so if I click on square footage here, a table will come up for each census block. I have the square footage for each of these occupancies. Okay, so these are different residential occupancies, which I'll talk about later. And I'm just going to click on close here, but you can see with any of these tables I can actually map these if I click on the column and then click on map, and you'll see the map here shows my square footage for my Res 1, which is a single family home. So the amount of square footage, and this is in thousands of square feet. So I can kind of zoom in here and I can see that information. Okay, so one thing I want to point out here, this is census block, but this is called isometric census blocks, and what they've done is they've actually clipped out that part of the census block that isn't supposed to have buildings in it. Okay, so they've taken a look at the land use in the area, and everything that is listed as forestry, wetlands, certain codes have been pulled out of the data. So what they're trying to do is give you a better representation of where the building stock actually resides. Now this can cause some issues, and this has been done for the whole country, so it's kind of coarse. They didn't actually go through each county and verify this information. So there's different ways we can address some of these limitations. And what we can do is I'll actually bring up some of the information here. So if I zoom in here, you'll see, so everything in green here, they basically are saying that there is no buildings. So if we were to bring up our satellite image and add that to the map here, and what I'll do is I'll just uncheck those tracks and blocks in the study region, and kind of zoom in here. Okay, so what's also what I'm going to do is just open this layer, take a look at this layer and make it transparent so we can kind of see what's behind it. So I change that transparency to 50% and click OK. Okay, so you can kind of start to see the structures behind here. However, there are areas that may not have any structures. and basically some places in the country are better than others. You know, some aren't so good, and some are pretty good. So it's good just kind of take a look at this information just to see, you know, one thing that can be concerning here is it's not showing that there are buildings here. These buildings are not only there, actually they look pretty big too, they're right on the coastline as well, so these are maybe impacted by coastal flooding, by surge as well. So you know, this is something that we may want to address with our data, and I'm going to have, in the future, I'm going to have a separate training that kind of goes through how you would want to integrate this into your analysis to make sure it's not lost. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just kind of zoom back to the county. We'll actually just remove the base map here, and so that's one type of data we have in Hazus. The other type are the site-specific data. So looking at the essential facilities, we have medical care facilities, we have emergency operations centers, we have fire stations, and we have police stations. And then we also have schools as well. And you'll see all 5 of these data sets I can basically map. Click close, and you'll see I've got individual structures represented by a point here. Okay, and a lot of these are pretty close. If I bring up my base map again, I can kind of see what this school looks like. Okay, right here. Okay, so that's probably the school here. It's a pretty good location. One thing that may be an issue, however, is it is being represented by a point and not by the building footprint. So when I run the analysis in my floodplain, let's say my floodplain comes through this parking lot and hits part of this building, okay, Hazus is going to model no damage because this point is outside the floodplain over here. If I want damage to be modeled, I actually have to place the point into the floodplain so that it gets damaged by the flood. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit later as well, and it might have a separate training on just making sure your point data is in the correct location. So again, you've got point locations represented by single latitude and longitude, and then you also have aggregate data represented by the census block or census tract. Okay. We also have high potential loss facilities, but Hazus does not model these in the flood model. So dams and levees, nuclear power plants, military installations are here, but again, they are not modeled in the flood model. The earthquake model has some, supports that a little bit, but not too much. There's also hazmat facilities. These are not modeled. They're just for display purposes. And you'll see I don't even have a way to map these at this point. So I actually have to go into the state data and map it that way. We also have user-defined facilities, so UDF. So these are basically all the points that are not that I want to model that are not already located in Hazus. So some communities have actually decided to model everything in their study region as a point. Okay, so they would use this user-defined facility database here to model every point in their community instead of using the aggregate data. Okay, so this could be a little bit time intensive, and I'm going to actually have a separate training that goes through how to do that modeling and some tricks to doing it. It does take several hours to do, so it's going to be a separate training for us. Under inventory, we also have transportation systems here. The only thing that the flood model models for damage are the bridges. Okay, so these tunnels and segments are not actually modeled in the flood model. They're only modeled in the earthquake model. Okay, we do have bus, port, ferry, airport are here as well. Okay, so if we do have information there, okay, we can model losses. We also have utility systems as well that we can model. So we have potable water here, wastewater, oil, natural gas, electric power, and communications. Okay, and you'll see all these, everything here that's already here is provided in Hazus. So I have not added any information here. It is already in Hazus. Okay, and I can map these as well. Okay, so I can only just so many schools here. So I can look at my wastewater facilities here. Okay, so I have utilities. I also have demographic information. Okay, so by census block, I've got information on the population, age, ethnicity, also income levels. We also have where the population resides during the day, during the night, work at home. Different information about the structures themselves, rental units as well, so that can be important, especially with flood. And we also have rent information here. Okay, so we have a lot of demographic data that we can look at as well. And again, if I want to look at any of this information, I click on the column and I click on map. Okay, I also have agricultural products in the software that we can look at. We have different areas, sub-county areas that have data on the different crops. That is available only in the flood model and not the other models. We also have vehicle information. So where are the cars during the day, during the night? Okay, the numbers of vehicles as well as the dollar exposure of vehicles as well. Okay, so that's basically the inventory in Hazus. And so everything that I've looked at so far is basically provided in Hazus. I haven't added any information, but I could. Okay, all these tables I can actually import here, or I can use the CDMS software, which I'll show you here in just a minute as well. So CDMS basically installs at the same time you install Hazus software, and you can use it to import your own local data. Okay, so I'll go through that in a separate training as well. So under inventory, like I said, this information can be updated, and there's a couple different ways to update it. If I do go into these tables and update the data in these tables, the data is only updated in this study region. Okay, so it is not updated at the state level. If I create another study region, the data will not be updated. However, if I use the CDMS tool to update the data, then all my future study regions will have that new data in it. Okay, so another great reason to use CDMS. The other component of our risk is our hazard. So we can actually set up a flood in the software. Now, Hazus has its own H&H model. However, that model is never meant to supplant the detailed engineering models that FEMA has developed at the Map Service Center. So what we recommend is actually going to the Map Service Center. So again, that was msc.fema.gov, and actually going in, and what I'm going to do is look at the products for Virginia Beach. So I'm going to select Virginia here under the state, and I'm going to select Virginia Beach. Okay, I'm going to select the city of Virginia Beach and click on search. Okay, and I'll see my effective products here. And what I want to do is download this NFHL, that's the National Flood Hazard Layer for the county. And I'll click on download here. You'll see it's 64 megs, so it'll take a few minutes to download for me, but I've actually already downloaded it, and I can use that information to create a flood depth grid. which is basically what Hazus is going to want. So under hazard, what I would do, if Virginia Beach has both riverine and coastal flooding, so what I would do is under my flood hazard type, I'm going to select both riverine and coastal and click OK. And then under hazard and scenario, actually in the user data here, I can then bring in my depth grid. So after I create my depth grid, which I'm going to talk about in a different training, I would browse that depth grid and I would bring that in. If I had a coastal depth grid and a riverine depth grid, I would bring those in separately and click OK, and it would process them and incorporate them into the study. You also notice that if let's say I'm in a community that doesn't have a floodplain that has been studied by FEMA, I can actually use Hazus to generate the floodplain using this DEM. And I would basically select this. It's going to go out to a website and start downloading an elevation model, be the USGS website. It'll allow me to select what resolution that DEM is. So if I want the 1/3 arcsecond, I can select that, or the 1 arcsecond. And basically what it's going to do is generate a floodplain using that elevation data. Okay. It also uses the USGS regression equations for the modeling, and basically you'll end up with a depth grid as the final product. Okay, so this will be a depth grid for the riverine area. It does require a lot of processing. It will, of course, model the entire watershed. So the bigger the watershed, the more processing it's going to require. The coastal model basically uses a simplified Loftus model to do the coastal flood modeling, and you can run that analysis as well. That doesn't require the watershed DEM. It just requires a DEM around the study region. Okay, so again, the output is going to be a depth grid. That depth grid is not going to match up with the engineered depth grid. And depending on what part of the country you're in and what's going on, if there's a lot of urban area here, that analysis might be more off. So I recommend using, again, the FEMA depth grid, the FEMA floodplain, generating a depth grid from that, and integrating that into Hazus. So once you have the inventory set and the hazard set, then you run the analysis, and you get results. So you'll have results. Basically damages and losses for your inventory, and that's going to be basically what a lot of folks put into their hazard mitigation plan. You know, you'll have your floodplain, which you can map and put in your plan, and then you'll also have your losses, and you can show those losses by residential area, commercial, industrial, all the different occupancy classifications. You can show losses by building type. You can show, let's say manufactured building losses in certain areas. So you'll generate maps of those. So that'll give you a chance to kind of go through your results and pick out things you want to show in the plan. But like I said, a couple of things that I do recommend when you do the analysis. If you're going to do a general building stock analysis, which a lot of folks have done, there's not a lot of funding available to do these risk assessments, and a lot of folks just kind of basically do what I showed you today, and it basically is called a level 1 analysis, where you maybe even have Hazus generate the floodplain, but you have kind of a really basic analysis at the census block level. And it's not the greatest analysis. There's a lot of limitations there. Like I said, if your census block doesn't match your buildings, you can get a lot of difference in the loss. So a couple of things you can do to help that. There are building footprint data that's available for basically the whole country. So you can download that data, which I'll show you in a different training. A lot of cities, a lot of counties actually have that data available that you can download. And what I would recommend is just taking all these census tracts or census blocks and trimming them based on those footprints. So then you'll know exactly where your structures reside, and you'll get a much better analysis at the end. So that's kind of, basic. It might take like an hour to do or so. It's not a huge undertaking, but it'll give you a much better result. The other idea is to actually go in and do an analysis at the site level. So each structure will be represented by a point, okay, and that will give you an even better result. And you'll have those results for every single structure in your area, so you'll know which building sustains what kind of damage. So I'll show you how to do that in a future training. So a couple of things there. Another thing you should look out for when we start looking at our individual structures, so looking at these schools again, I'm going to map those. Okay, you'll see if I look at my school data, there's quite a few of them. I scroll over here, there's a lot of required fields here. So in order to run the analysis in the software, you need to make sure that you have the school classification. So ESFS1 or ESFS2, depending on whether it is a grade school or a university college. You also have the replacement costs here. This is in thousands of dollars. So this is $14.5 million, $14.6 million dollars in this first one. Okay, so you have to have the replacement costs. You also have the foundation type. Okay, so this 7 actually means slab on grade. So we'll talk about the different foundation types in a future training. But that's what that means. And the first floor height here as well. You'll see by default all these have a 0 foot first floor height, which is not realistic at all. Even with a slab on grade, you have at least 1 foot there. So it's not accounted for here. So it's all zeros. So this is something that you'd want to update. The other thing I want to make sure that you are aware of, these are the foundation of the damage function IDs. So this basically tells Hazus what damage function to use for the building and the contents. Now if you have a building that is in the V zone, okay, you'll want to make sure that building has a damage function associated with it that is appropriate for the V zone and not the A zone. Okay, so these by default are all A zone damage functions. So if I go close this and open my analysis and damage functions and go to buildings, okay, you'll see I've got structure here, riverine is selected. However, I also have a coastal V zone, so I can select that coastal V zone and go to my library. Okay, just click on my library. Looking at residential 1 structures, so I'd want to look at basically what is a school function, which will be our government structure. Sorry. School will be EDU1, so EDU1, and you'll see here I have damage function IDs for different V zone damage functions. So I have saltwater, long duration, short duration here that I can select. But these are basically my V zone damage function IDs. Okay, so once let's say it's an elementary school that I want to use, short duration flood, I would want to use a 648 here. So going back to my table, inventory, essential facilities, schools, If that school was in a V zone, I would want to make sure it had a damage function that was associated with that V zone. Okay, here, that value there. And actually, I can come in here and I can actually edit this directly and then save those edits as well. Okay, so those are some of the things that I need to make sure are populated correctly when I run the analysis. Okay, otherwise I may get incorrect information. Okay, so a couple of tricks there, a couple of things that I think get people messed up when they run the analysis. And I think that is what I was going to show today for flood. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to a different hazard, a different study region. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open the same one, but I'm going to select hurricane this time. Okay, so it's Virginia Beach again, but we're looking at the hurricane model instead of the flood. So one thing I've seen in almost all the Virginia hazard mitigation plans is there's a sentence or two that's basically say the Hazus hurricane model will not generate losses for jurisdictions smaller than a county. Okay, or jurisdictions smaller than a census tract. Okay, and that is just not correct. So when I created my study region, I created a hurricane flood study region for Virginia Beach. Okay, I selected the entire county, the entire city of Virginia Beach as my study region. Because I selected a flood and a hurricane study region, I can zoom in here I think what happens is a lot of people see the census tracts and they're like, well, if my town is smaller than the census tract, I can't really do anything with the software. But what they don't understand is because I've selected both hurricane and flood, so what I'm doing is I'm opening my inventory and I'm going to map my Res 1. You'll see here, if I had selected hurricane only, these would be census tracts, but because I picked flood and hurricane, they are census blocks. It's going to take a little bit to regenerate because it is it's a big data set because we're looking at census blocks and not tracts now. So because I have census blocks in my inventory, you can identify a jurisdiction with a census block. A lot of jurisdictions cannot be defined by census tract. Census tracts are determined by population. And census blocks are determined by more like physical things, like city blocks or a river or something physical that divides the community. So what I can do though is I can run my analysis. So if I go to analysis and run, all my results are going to be at the census block level. And so what I can do is I can basically bring in my my jurisdictional boundary, and I can query everything in that jurisdictional boundary and pull that out as a separate result. Okay, so I can get inventory information in this model, I can get results in this model at the census block level, and so I can get sub-county and sub-city losses here. Okay, so all those who are writing the mitigation plan that the hurricane model doesn't support sub-county losses, so So I can't show that for each individual jurisdiction, which you should be doing, by the way. If you're doing that correctly, you should be looking at each jurisdiction that is working on the mitigation plan together. So that's one thing that you should be doing. Another thing I wanted to point out is the inventory is going to be the same as what we saw in the flood model. Okay, it looks a little bit different. We have a different tab for each type of inventory here. However, when you run the analysis, in the flood model I get losses, I get damage and losses. And in the hurricane model, I actually just get my damage state probabilities. Okay, so I don't quite get the results I do in the flood model. I haven't actually run the analysis, so these are not going to have any results in them. But you can see here, what would happen is this would be populated with the damage state probability. Okay, for my different return periods. In this case, I ran a probabilistic. Probabilistic is basically set up currently. Okay. Another thing I wanted to point out in the hurricane model is we do now have the ability to bring in a user-defined surge depth grid. Okay, so if I go to my hazard, set up my scenario. Now, one thing I will point out is the user-defined surge is only available for deterministic hurricanes. So if you're trying to do a probabilistic hurricane, you can't use it. So if I go to analysis and I click on user supplied coastal surge grid, I can click on that and it will go to from no to yes. Then I can supply it with my surge grid in the flood model. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that in a separate training. But so that's something you can do now, and so I think we'll see a lot of folks start to use that option more often. It allows you a little bit more control over the surge that you input into Hazus instead of having Hazus generate the surge, which if you haven't done it before, it can take a long time to run the surge model in the software. Okay, so there's something else there in the hurricane model. So that was what I want to talk about in the hurricane model. Let me go ahead and I'm going to switch to earthquake. Okay, so the next hazard is the earthquake model. What I'm going to do is just open up a region here. I've already created a region in Richmond. So I'm going to click on next and hit finish. So again, we've got another urban area in central Virginia. It'll just take a minute to come up. But although we don't usually think of earthquake as a very prevalent hazard here in the state of Virginia, we have received a few over the last couple of years. So I do want to talk about some of the limitations with earthquakes in the software. So a lot of the earthquake sections and the mitigation plans that I've seen in a lot of the East Coast, actually, they are pretty slim on analysis. There's several different earthquakes you can run in the software. There aren't quite as many capabilities as you have on the West Coast with the software, but we can do a little bit better, I think, a job analyzing the hazard. So one thing I want to point out about the software and the limitation is looking at the inventory here. I'm going to look at general building stock and building count for the city of Richmond here. And I'm going to basically look at the building types. And these are the number of building types. So W is wood, S is steel, And these are all the different building types. We have concrete, we have precast. Okay, so we have unreinforced masonry, we have manufactured housing. But one thing I want to point out is you'll see that all of these columns, they have zeros. Okay, L is low rise, so it's 1 to 3 stories. Okay, these are M is medium rise, moderate rise. H is high rise. So basically, what this is saying is the city of Richmond, Virginia, has no medium or high rise buildings. Everything is 1 to 3 stories. Okay, so this is a pretty serious limitation with the inventory. That is still there today. And under reinforced masonry, M is basically 3 plus for number of stories. So all the unreinforced masonry is 1 to 2 stories in the city of Richmond. Okay, and some of these cities in Virginia, we have old unreinforced masonry. You see a lot of old brick buildings out there in some of these cities, and they are not 1 to 2 stories. They're higher, and your higher, taller buildings, they withstand earthquakes differently than your low rise. Okay, so right off the bat, if you're doing a level 1 analysis using this software for an urban area with a lot of high rises, a lot of unreinforced masonry high rises, or 3 plus stories, not even that high, your analysis is not going to be very good. So that's one issue I see right off the bat. So you'll want to basically update those tables if you're doing an analysis where you're looking at census tracts rather, in an urban area. You'll want to go in and update those percentages, and you can do that looking at parcel data that the city or the county might have for you. A lot of the parcel data has number of stories. There are some data sets out there that have the building footprints, and within those footprints they have attributes that show number of stories. You can also combine data sets, so you can have a building footprint and you can have parcel data associated with it. And so if you do a area of that building footprint and compare it to the number of square feet that the building is supposed to have, you can kind of determine roughly how many square footage or how many number of stories the building has, doing some simple math there. So there's a couple different ways you can kind of go about updating your data, but you'll want to update that data because you're not going to get good results. The other thing I'll mention is when you run a probabilistic analysis in the software for the earthquake model, it is different than the hurricane model. Okay, what happens is the software looks at the USGS ground shaking, probabilistic ground shaking for that area. So USGS has created a grid, okay, ground shaking for the country, and so you can kind of see what the ground shaking looks like in your area. But what you'll see is the ground shaking doesn't really deviate too much across the study region. Okay, so it's going to be pretty similar. You will have differences where you have different soil types. Okay, so if you do have big soil type differences in your community, okay, you'll see a little difference there when you run the analysis. But when you're just looking at the USGS grids, they're going to be pretty uniform across your study region. So you'll see in your results are a lot of the same impacts across the region. Okay, so that is not similar to a real earthquake. A real earthquake has an epicenter. At that epicenter, you're going to have much more ground shaking than you will across the way as you get away from the epicenter. So what I recommend is to not only look at probabilistic analysis, but also to look at some of the historic analysis in the area. One thing that they've done in the software that's a little bit newer, if you go to hazard and scenario, you can actually click on next here, you define a new scenario. I can actually look at the USGS shake maps for the area as well. These include not just historical areas, historical events, but also modeled events as well. So the historical events are this first option here, and I can change my earthquake time frame from 90 days to You can do like 5,000 days. You can do, pretty far back in time. Now, because I'm in Virginia, basically I'm going to do this search and I'm not going to find anything. If I hit scenario here, probably the same thing is going to occur. I can hit search, probably not going to find anything again. However, within the state, there is a database of historic events. So in my future training, where I kind of focus in on earthquakes, I'll talk about what that looks like. But if you have a historic database of events, there's one in Hazus, but the state actually has a better one. I can kind of take a look. If I right-click on this table, I can map it. So I can kind of see what has occurred. If I zoom out a little bit, let's see, it's not too much here, but I can kind of identify a couple of these events to see what they are. Okay, so it's magnitude 5. I'm not going to find anything less than a magnitude 5 in the Hazus database, but you will in the state database. Okay, so it might be helpful to actually create a take one of these historic events in time and recreate it with today's building stock. So you can kind of see what will happen, and you'll see that around the epicenter you'll have a lot of damage, and then as you leave the epicenter you'll have less damage. Okay, so that'll give you a better indication of kind of what kind of damage and loss of life you might encounter. So I do recommend not just looking at probabilistic analysis, but also think about creating your own real earthquake scenario. Whether it's historical or working with your state geologists on creating a scenario that makes sense for your region. It doesn't make sense for me just to plop a magnitude 8 earthquake here and say, let's plan for that. So, using those two are kind of what I recommend for mitigation planning in this particular area. So those are kind of some of the main. Again, you can do user-defined facilities as well if you want to look at some of your maybe essential facilities that you have here, and you'll get a little bit more. You'll get more results than you would with the hurricane model. The hurricane model is a little bit different with the probabilistic, because what it does is it actually has a database of modeled events that it looks through, and it selects everything that could impact your region, and then it looks at the losses that are generated from those modeled storms, and selects the 100-year loss or the 500-year loss or the 1,000-year loss. So it's a little bit different than what the earthquake model does. Okay, so there's a couple of tricks there, a couple of ideas for running the earthquake model in this area.